In a world filled with questions, where wisdom knows no boundaries, join us on a journey of enlightenment and endless learning. Eternal Teachings. TV. Discover the eternal.
In the theatre of global conflicts, history has a tendency to echo, reverberating through the actions and decisions of nations, leaders, and soldiers. As the world watches with bated breath, 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers have reportedly crossed into Russian territory, specifically into the historic region of Kursk. This audacious move marks a significant escalation in the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, reminiscent of a time when the world was embroiled in one of the most devastating wars in human history. The last time Russia faced an invasion on its soil was during the infamous Operation Barbarossa in 1941, when Nazi Germany launched a massive military campaign against the Soviet Union. The scale, strategy, and eventual consequences of that invasion left an indelible mark on global history. Now, in the 21st century, this small-scale incursion into Russian territory carries a weight far beyond its size, potentially reshaping geopolitical alliances, military strategies, and the very future of international relations. This detailed analysis will delve into the many facets of this event, examining its historical parallels, the strategic motivations behind Ukraine's bold move, the potential responses from Russia, the geopolitical implications involving the BRICS nations, and the looming threat of nuclear escalation. Through a cinematic narrative lens, we will explore how this moment could become a defining chapter in the history of modern warfare, much like the echoes of Operation Barbarossa that still resonate today. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, the skies over the Soviet Union darkened with the approach of thousands of German aircraft. The land itself trembled under the relentless advance of millions of Nazi soldiers, tanks, and artillery. Operation Barbarossa had begun, the largest military invasion in history, and it was aimed squarely at the heart of Russia. The initial onslaught was devastating, with German forces pushing deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast swathes of land and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. But as the brutal Russian winter set in, the tide began to turn. The vastness of the Russian landscape, coupled with the fierce resistance of its people, bogged down the German war machine. The Battle of Stalingrad became a turning point, where the seemingly invincible Nazi forces were encircled and decimated. The cost was immense, with millions of lives lost, but the Soviet Union emerged victorious, eventually pushing the Germans back to Berlin and contributing to the fall of the Third Reich. Fast forward to the present, and the sight of Ukrainian soldiers stepping onto Russian soil in Kursk is fraught with symbolic significance. While the scale and context differ vastly from Operation Barbarossa, the act of invading Russian territory, no matter how small, is a bold and provocative gesture that cannot be overlooked. It challenges the perception of Russia's invulnerability, much like Barbarossa did, and sets the stage for a potentially grueling conflict. The decision to send 1,000 soldiers into Russian territory is not one made lightly. For Ukraine, this move is a calculated gamble with potentially far-reaching consequences. To understand why Ukraine might undertake such a daring operation, one must consider the broader context of the ongoing conflict and Ukraine's strategic objectives. Ukraine has been locked in a protracted and bloody conflict with Russia since 2014, following the annexation of Crimea and the subsequent war in the Donbas region. Over the years, Ukraine has worked to bolster its military capabilities, gain international support, and resist Russian advances. However, the war has taken a heavy toll on both the Ukrainian population and its military forces. By crossing into Kursk, Ukraine is likely aiming to achieve several key objectives. Firstly, this incursion could serve as a psychological blow to Russia, disrupting its narrative of military dominance and invincibility. It sends a clear message that Ukraine is not only capable of defending its territory, but is also willing to take the fight to Russian soil. This move could also be intended to boost Ukrainian morale, showcasing the bravery and resolve of its soldiers in the face of a much larger adversary. Moreover, this operation could be designed to force Russia into diverting resources away from its offensive operations in Ukraine. By creating a new front in Kursk, Ukraine could stretch Russian forces thinner, potentially weakening their positions elsewhere in the conflict. This tactic, while risky, could pay off if it leads to significant disruptions in Russian military operations. Finally, this incursion might be aimed at galvanizing international support for Ukraine. By taking such a bold step, Ukraine could draw more attention to its plight, potentially leading to increased military and economic aid from Western nations. The symbolism of this move, coupled with the historical parallels to Barbarossa, could resonate deeply with those who see the current conflict as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. As the situation in Kursk unfolds, the geopolitical implications extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russia. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have emerged as a formidable alliance, challenging the traditional Western-dominated world order. Their collective declaration to stand strong against Western pressure, particularly in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, highlights the complex dynamics at play on the global stage. The BRICS alliance is not merely an economic coalition. It represents a shift in the balance of power, with these nations seeking to assert their influence in global affairs. For Russia, the support of BRICS is crucial, as it provides a counterbalance to the economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation imposed by the West. The solidarity of these nations, particularly China and India, with Russia in this conflict, could have significant consequences for the global geopolitical landscape. China, with its growing economic and military might, has been a key ally for Russia, providing economic support and diplomatic backing in international forums. India, while maintaining a more nuanced stance, has also engaged in significant trade with Russia, particularly in the energy sector. Brazil and South Africa, though geographically distant, have voiced their opposition to Western interference in the internal affairs of sovereign nations, aligning with Russia's narrative. The BRICS alliance's response to the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk will be closely watched. Will they continue to support Russia unequivocally, or will they urge restraint to avoid a larger conflict that could destabilize the global economy? The stance of these nations will be critical in shaping the next phase of this conflict, and could determine whether it remains a regional war or escalates into a broader international crisis. Russia's response, a test of resolve and strategy. The adage, "People can enter Russia at their will, but they can only leave with the Russians' permission," carries a chilling reminder of the consequences that those who invade Russian territory might face. Russia's response to the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk will not only determine the fate of the Ukrainian soldiers involved, but could also set the tone for the next phase of the conflict. Historically, Russia has shown a propensity for enduring and ultimately prevailing in prolonged conflicts. The Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany is the most prominent example, but Russia's resilience has been tested and proven in numerous other conflicts throughout its history. From the Mongol invasions to the Napoleonic Wars, and from the Ottoman Empire to the Nazi regime, Russia has faced and overcome formidable adversaries, often at great cost. Given this historical context, Russia's leadership, particularly President Vladimir Putin, may view the Ukrainian incursion as both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, it presents a challenge to Russia's territorial integrity and military supremacy, which Putin has worked diligently to maintain. On the other hand, it offers an opportunity for Russia to demonstrate its resolve and military prowess, potentially using this incursion as a pretext for a more aggressive campaign in Ukraine or even beyond. The Russian military response could range from a measured and calculated retaliation aimed at containing the incursion and sending a message to Ukraine and its allies, to a full-scale escalation that could see Russian forces pushing deeper into Ukrainian territory. The latter scenario carries significant risks, including the potential for a broader regional conflict and even the involvement of NATO forces. In the Kremlin, the decision-makers will weigh these options carefully, considering both the military and political ramifications. The international community, particularly NATO and the European Union, will also be closely monitoring Russia's response, as any significant escalation could trigger a broader conflict with far-reaching consequences. The nuclear spectre, the unthinkable threat. In any conflict involving nuclear-armed states, the possibility of nuclear escalation is a spectre that looms large. Both Russia and Ukraine possess nuclear capabilities, although Ukraine's nuclear arsenal was dismantled after the fall of the Soviet Union. However, the potential for nuclear weapons to be brought into play, either through direct use or as a deterrent, is a terrifying prospect that cannot be ignored. The concept of nuclear deterrence has been a cornerstone of global security since the end of World War II. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, has, thus far, prevented the use of nuclear weapons in conflicts between major powers. However, the current situation in Ukraine, particularly with the possibility of Russian territory being breached, introduces a level of unpredictability that is deeply concerning. Russia's nuclear doctrine allows for the use of nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack that threatens the existence of the state. While the incursion into Kursk by 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers may not meet this threshold, the escalation of the conflict could create conditions where the use of tactical nuclear weapons becomes a consideration. This is especially true if Russia perceives its strategic positions or critical infrastructure as being under significant threat. The international community, particularly the nuclear powers, will need to engage in intensive diplomatic efforts to prevent the situation from reaching this point. The stakes are incredibly high, and the consequences of a nuclear exchange, even on a limited scale, would be catastrophic. The world can only hope that cooler heads will prevail and that diplomacy will succeed in de-escalating the situation before it spirals out of control. However, given the current dynamics of the conflict, a detailed examination of the potential pathways to either escalation or resolution is necessary to understand the gravity of what lies ahead. The paths of escalation, from tactical engagements to global conflict. The Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory is a flashpoint that could trigger a range of escalatory scenarios. These pathways, though speculative, are grounded in the patterns of past conflicts and the strategic calculations that both Russia and Ukraine, along with their allies and adversaries, might undertake. 1. Tactical escalation. The most immediate response to the Ukrainian soldiers entering Kursk would likely involve direct military engagement. Russian forces could swiftly encircle and attempt to neutralize the Ukrainian incursion, using conventional military power to reclaim control of the area. This might involve airstrikes, artillery bombardments, and ground assaults aimed at overwhelming the Ukrainian forces before they can establish a strong foothold. Such a response would serve as a clear demonstration of Russia's military superiority and a deterrent to any further attempts to challenge its territorial integrity. 2. Strategic escalation. If Russia perceives the Ukrainian incursion as part of a broader strategy to destabilize or threaten its borders, it might respond with a more extensive military campaign. This could involve the mobilization of additional troops, the deployment of advanced weaponry, and the targeting of critical Ukrainian infrastructure to degrade its military capabilities. The objective would be to force Ukraine into a position where it must either retreat or face overwhelming losses. This scenario carries the risk of drawing in neighboring countries and possibly leading to a broader regional conflict. 3. Asymmetric escalation. Russia could choose to escalate asymmetrically, using cyber attacks, economic warfare, or covert operations to undermine Ukraine's resolve and retaliate without engaging in a full-scale military confrontation. Cyber attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure, such as power grids, communication networks, or financial systems, could cause significant disruption and sow chaos. Economic measures, such as cutting off energy supplies or imposing trade sanctions, could further strain Ukraine's economy and weaken its war effort. Covert operations, including sabotage and targeted assassinations, could destabilize the Ukrainian government and military leadership, creating confusion and undermining morale. 4. Nuclear escalation. The most dangerous path is the potential use of nuclear weapons. Although it remains a last resort, the possibility cannot be dismissed entirely. If Russia perceives an existential threat, whether through a perceived encirclement by NATO, the loss of critical territories, or the collapse of its military positions, it might consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons to force a resolution on its terms. Such an action would have catastrophic consequences, not only for the immediate region, but for the entire world, as it would likely provoke a global response and possibly lead to a nuclear exchange. The role of international actors, NATO, the EU, and global diplomacy. As tensions escalate, the role of international actors becomes increasingly critical in determining the outcome of the conflict. NATO, the European Union, and other global powers have a vested interest in preventing a full-scale war, especially one that could involve nuclear weapons. Their actions, or inaction, will significantly influence the trajectory of the conflict. NATO faces a delicate balancing act. On one hand, it must demonstrate solidarity with Ukraine and deter further Russian aggression. On the other hand, it must avoid provoking a response that could lead to a wider conflict. NATO's options include reinforcing its eastern flank with additional troops and military assets, increasing intelligence and surveillance efforts, and providing Ukraine with advanced military technology to bolster its defense. However, any direct involvement in the conflict could escalate the situation dramatically, potentially leading to a confrontation between nuclear-armed powers. The European Union, while not a military alliance like NATO, plays a significant role in the diplomatic and economic dimensions of the conflict. The EU could impose additional sanctions on Russia, aiming to weaken its economy and reduce its capacity to sustain the war. Diplomatic efforts could focus on engaging with Russian allies, particularly within the BRICS alliance, to encourage restraint and seek a negotiated settlement. However, the EU must also contend with its own internal divisions, as member states may have differing views on how to respond to the crisis, particularly those more reliant on Russian energy supplies. Beyond NATO and the EU, global diplomatic efforts will be essential in de-escalating the situation. The United Nations, despite its often limited effectiveness in conflict resolution, could serve as a platform for dialogue and negotiations. Countries with close ties to both Russia and Ukraine, such as Turkey, India, or China, could act as intermediaries, facilitating talks and proposing peace initiatives. The involvement of non-Western powers, particularly China and India, could be crucial in persuading Russia to seek a diplomatic resolution rather than continuing down the path of escalation. The BRICS nations, particularly China and India, hold significant sway in this conflict. As Russia's economic and strategic partners, their position could influence Russia's decisions. If BRICS members advocate for restraint and a peaceful resolution, it could encourage Russia to consider diplomatic avenues. Conversely, if BRICS nations choose to support Russia's military actions, it could embolden Moscow to escalate further. The position of China, in particular, will be closely watched, as its influence on Russia is substantial, and its stance on the conflict could sway the broader international response. The human cost, civilians, refugees, and the impact on global stability. Beyond the military and geopolitical considerations, the human cost of this conflict cannot be overlooked. The escalation of hostilities, particularly if they spread beyond Ukraine's borders, would have devastating consequences for civilians, leading to a humanitarian crisis on a scale not seen since World War II. As the conflict intensifies, civilian populations in both Ukraine and Russia are at risk. In Ukraine, Towns and cities near the front lines would likely face increased bombardment, leading to significant casualties and widespread destruction. Russian civilians in border regions, such as Kursk, could also be caught in the crossfire, particularly if the conflict escalates into Russian territory. The psychological impact of living in a war zone, combined with the loss of life and property, would be profound, leaving scars that could last for generations. An escalation of the conflict could trigger a massive refugee crisis, as millions of people flee the violence. Neighboring countries, particularly in Europe, would likely see a significant influx of refugees, straining resources and potentially leading to social and political tensions. The European Union, already grappling with the challenges of integrating refugees from previous conflicts, would face additional pressures, requiring a coordinated and compassionate response to manage the humanitarian crisis. The ripple effects of the conflict would extend far beyond the immediate region. The disruption of global trade, particularly in energy and agricultural commodities, could exacerbate economic instability, leading to higher prices and shortages worldwide. The strain on global supply chains, already impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, could deepen, leading to further economic uncertainty. Additionally, the potential for a broader conflict involving NATO and other global powers would have severe implications for global security, raising the specter of a new Cold War or even a direct military confrontation between nuclear-armed states. Diplomatic paths to resolution, de-escalation, and peace negotiations. While the prospect of escalation looms large, there remains the possibility of diplomatic resolution. Preventing the conflict from spiraling out of control will require concerted efforts from all parties involved, as well as the broader international community. The first step toward de-escalation would likely involve negotiating a ceasefire agreement between Ukraine and Russia. This would require the involvement of neutral mediators, potentially from countries outside the immediate conflict zone, who could facilitate dialogue and build trust between the parties. A ceasefire would create the necessary space for more comprehensive peace talks, allowing both sides to present their demands and explore potential compromises. Once a ceasefire is in place, the focus would shift to peace talks aimed at addressing the underlying issues driving the conflict. These talks would need to be inclusive, involving not only Ukraine and Russia, but also key international stakeholders, including NATO, the European Union, and the BRICS nations. The discussions would likely center on issues such as territorial integrity, security guarantees, and the rights of ethnic minorities in conflict zones. Finding a diplomatic solution would require significant concessions from both sides, as well as guarantees from the international community to ensure the durability of any agreement reached. To support the peace process, both sides would need to engage in confidence-building measures designed to reduce tensions and prevent the resumption of hostilities. These could include the withdrawal of troops from contested areas, the exchange of prisoners, and the establishment of demilitarized zones. International observers, potentially from the United Nations or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, could play a critical role in monitoring these measures and ensuring compliance. Achieving a lasting peace would require not only resolving the immediate conflict, but also addressing the long-term issues that have fueled tensions between Ukraine and Russia. This would involve promoting economic development in war-torn regions, fostering political reconciliation between opposing factions, and supporting the rebuilding of communities devastated by the war. The international community, particularly the European Union, would have a vital role to play in providing the financial and technical assistance needed to support these efforts and ensure that peace is sustainable in the long term. Conclusion: a pivotal moment in history. The Ukrainian soldiers' incursion into the Russian territory of Kursk is more than just a tactical maneuver. It is a pivotal moment in the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia.